The Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health, Human Services, Education, and other related agencies will come to order. Started a few minutes late. The good news is I'll submit part of my opening statement for the record as a result of part of the delay being on me. Glad we're here. This is our first budget hearing of this year. Thank you, Secretary DeVos, for appearing before the subcommittee again today to discuss the department's FY2020 budget request and help us kick off our process for this year. Last year, we passed the labor HHS bill prior to the start of the fiscal year for the first time in 22 years. The conference agreement received 93 votes on the Senate floor. It's a pattern that I'd like to see develop. Of course, you don't have a pattern until year two, and so being able to do this again one more time would make a big difference. I hope we begin a trend that starts today. Last year, we got 75% of the government funded before the beginning of the fiscal year. The lesson of the shutdown should be that we should figure out what we did for 75% of the government and figure out how to get it done for 100% of the government. I would say the big obstacle we face in getting that done is having a number we can work with. And I want to go back to that as I talk about the budget that you've submitted. The importance of having a number and having it early really matters. We had that last year. Many of us on this committee advocated that number that we would actually be able to use would be available maybe as part of the beginning of the fiscal year for those agencies that weren't funded last year. I was disappointed that didn't happen, but it didn't. The FY2020 budget request for the department is $64 billion in discretionary funding. That's almost 10% less than the amount last year. Now, the request, frankly, is similar to last year's request in many respects. Like last year, it eliminates or consolidates approximately 30 programs. It significantly reduces funding for several others. All of the programs sponsored for elimination or significant reductions were proposed to be eliminated last year, too. I appreciate the decisions you have to make, and just as we approach this budget, we need to do that remembering that while we are unlikely, when we finally appropriate, to be bound by the Budget Control Act, it is the law. And the administration doesn't have quite the flexibility to wait for time to catch up with the law that we do. Discretionary spending under the Budget Control Act would reduce for non-defense would reduce by 9% this year. To remind my friends on the committee that President Trump did not sign the Budget Control Act, President Obama did. Secretary DeVos did not vote for the Budget Control Act. Almost every one of us who were here when we passed it did. And that's the law. It's a law that for the last couple of times at least we have figured out that it didn't seem to make sense in the current circumstances, but it's the law as it was put together, and it is still the law. We wouldn't be having this hearing in exactly the same way if we would have come up with what I believe would have been more realistic numbers, both for defense and non-defense, as part of ending last year's work, but we didn't get that done, and I hope we do get that done quickly. The President's budget proposes to reduce non-defense discretionary by $55 billion. That's almost exactly the reduction required by the law. The 9% that the law would require the President to use as his top number is the number that the President's budget is submitted. I agree that we really have to constantly evaluate programs and be willing to reduce or eliminate funding for programs that are ineffective and prioritize that funding elsewhere. In fact, Senator Murray and I and others on this committee did this, particularly the first 2 years we worked together when there was no new money, but we set some significant new priorities. And by doing that, I think we either eliminated or combined 32 different programs. So we have capacity to do that, and we should have the capacity to hear you out and look at the programs that you think we need to look at more carefully. There are programs here that are unlikely to be eliminated in any final budget, and I'm sure they'll be vigorously discussed. But I would remind my colleagues that one reason we have had for 3 years now, and for the first 3 years in well over a decade, a bipartisan committee report out of this committee is that we have worked hard not to make things we agree on more partisan than they need to be. This budget is not that much different from the budget the president submitted last year. My guess is that the work of this committee will not be that much different from the work of this committee last year, the work of this committee, what we did last year, and we'll see how this goes. So we're going to have this hearing today. Secretary, appreciate your willingness to take this job, the hard work that you have put into this job, and I'm sure there'll be a number of questions about the budget you've submitted. And